Thank you very much. Thank you all for staying all the way until lunchtime. I really appreciate it. So I'm going to make a slightly different type of presentation because obviously I'm not giving a pitch for a mining operation, but it's been very interesting to hear about all the investments that are being made, and I'm going to take a little bit of a story of the wider commodity world and the need for investment across the commodities. So CRU, if you don't know us, we're an independent company providing advice to the metals mining, fertiliser industries. My group, the consulting area, does a lot of work in terms of the market studies for financing and supporting that side of finance raising. Ooh, there we go, let's give it a build. So this is the structure of my presentation today, and I wanted to talk a little bit about three main areas. So kicking off with geopolitics, and I think we've heard a fair old bit about geopolitics this morning so far, the issues in Azerbaijan, the little rundown of what's happening in Chile, but obviously really important to think a little bit about how that's changing the investment patterns for different commodities around the world. And I'll talk a little bit about that. The other two sections are much more on the energy transition, and again we've heard about that already today. But energy generation is actually changing the commodities that are needed. Paul obviously talked a bit about that. We've talked a bit about lithium, and I wanted to focus on silicon, which is one of the commodities going into photovoltaics, and also just touch on rare earths because I knew that Paul was going to be talking about that before me. And at the end, the really interesting subject of the copper market. Obviously, you need to connect up where you're generating power in many more dispersed places than we used to do it. It used to be very concentrated. And also, we need to put those copper wires inside the turbines, inside the motors, inside the cars in much greater volume than we have in the past. And to be honest, we haven't found any great copper mines recently. So it's really quite challenging to get that copper to the market to be able to achieve that. At this point, I just want to mention a little bit about these colours. So, each year, CRU work with McKinsey and BRGM, which is the French Geological Survey, and we work with the World Material Forum to create a criticality index for the commodities across the periodic table. We assess 7 different KPIs, so looking at the lifespan of reserves, the uncertainty of supply, the political risk exposure of the supply chain, the ability to recycle the commodity, the uncertainty of the demand forecasts in terms of the end uses, its substitutability, and also its environmental performance, focusing on energy and water at the moment. And we rank those in a presentation which is actually happening next week, between red, which are the critical commodities, and yellow-green, which are less critical. And you can see that 2 of the 3 I've selected to talk about are on that critical list at the moment, in that consumers need to be considering carefully how they might obtain and keep their supply chain going of that commodity in the future. So this year the critical elements are lithium, we've heard about that. We've heard a little bit about cobalt, nickel, obviously in those same batteries, copper, lead and zinc, palladium, tin, tungsten, and then the rare earths, praseodymium, neodymium and dysprosium. So of the whole periodic table, we have today covered a lot of the commodities that we believe are the most critical. At the bottom I give the website there, and the presentations are posted online, so please do take a look. It's a really interesting criticality index. It's been developed over many years now. So moving on to ESG. This is into my geopolitics sector. A lot of the ESG announcements have really strongly focused on E, and in fact they focused on carbon. And I think we're now all learning that we need to go beyond just the E and the carbon into the S, some of the issues in Chile and Peru, and into the G to make sure that we're managing fully all aspects of the supply chains. These all do focus on E and specifically on carbon emissions because that's what people have been putting out. But do remember that throughout this presentation it's E and S and G that we need to be thinking about. So the key message from this is that lots and lots of people across all different parts of the value chain have made commitments to net zero. They've picked a date ending in 0 at some point, 40, 50, 60, and people are saying they need to achieve that. And then we've also had COP26, which was mentioned earlier, where lots of pledges came, again with numbers with zeros on the end of the dates, about how people were going to move towards a net zero world. And in fact, although there weren't major breakthroughs at COP26, there were a lot of commitments that should, in theory, keep temperature rises down a bit. But from the metals perspective, it still leaves open an awful lot of questions of how that transition's actually going to be made. And remember, we've heard you need to mine the commodities to make the goods to decarbonise the consumer world. It follows one from another. You can't decarbonise before the mining. So there's still very little consensus on how the money is actually going to be spent and when. So this is a slightly conceptual chart, but we're looking at what might happen. What are the routes to this magical number ending in a zero? 2050 we've chosen, where we're net zero. You could wait. You could invest your money in other things and wait for the technology solutions to be secure, and then hope that those technologies are in place to take a straight line path down towards the net zero. You'll also have some people who are investing really early in the current technologies, and they may find that that doesn't get them all the way. They might spend more money, and then they'll have to have another go later on. But there's very, very little actual consensus on the route that gets us from here to there, wherever there is, ending in a zero. We do know that where we have jurisdictions who are willing to add support, so where we're seeing policies that help companies to achieve this, we're seeing more investments being made. You could argue that the supply chain policies in the US around magnets, which we've heard a little bit about here, and the whole supply chain of rare earths from the mine right the way to the car, is excessively expensive or early. But it does actually mean that when you look at what Mountain Pass and the other rare earths companies are doing, what Paul was talking about, that you actually need to have materials created outside China today that will go into these huge value chains right the way through to the automotive over the period, which isn't too long, over the next 20 years. So it becomes a very interesting conversation of how we move from the top to the bottom of this chart. This is our commodity price forecast. So CRU is a price reporting agency as well as its wider business. And here I show the average price our analysts think this year of the commodities over last year. And I show this because I wanted to highlight how very high the prices are of the commodities I'm going to be talking about today. I think lithium also sits at the top, both now and when I come to a 2026 chart. So we definitely support the difficulties with lithium. How do I get rid of that now? There must be an escape button somewhere. There we go. But we're looking at silicon, which is incredibly hot at the moment, and I'll come into a little more detail on silicon. Copper still warm, but then remember how hot last year was in terms of copper prices, and beginning of this rare earth boom, where we're starting to need high prices to incentivise investment into the sector. So I'm going to come back to this chart at the end with 2026 over 2021, just to show how the basket moves and how these commodities fare. So copper, a little detour because this really should be towards the end. But when we're talking about financial investments, copper's had an incredible year so far off the back of those high prices. The deals announced are already at the highest level since 2012, and there's a possibility of exceeding the record transactional value that was in 2006 of $30 billion. It's noteworthy it includes 2 mine restarts, and also some very large individual deals like by the mining majors like Rio and Glencore who are in here. I think it's interesting that they're all in dollars. I think Alistair's presentation suggests we should do this in gold grams to get a more consistent pricing, but in dollars some very big deals. And you can see at the bottom the number of mergers dropping down, the little dashes, and then actually the value of those deals. So it's a very expensive market to get into if you're after an existing asset in copper at the moment. I'm going to come back to copper. Silicon, it hasn't really been touched on today, and it's yellow-green on our commodity criticality matrix from the World Material Forum. That's because there's a lot of other end uses for silicon that aren't in silicon metal. So here I'm looking at silicon metal. It's predominantly made in China. You can see at the top left in terms of production, but it's 2/3 Chinese dominated in terms of production. In terms of investment, you can see at the bottom there of capacity, they're aiming to triple their capacity of polysilicon production over the next 3 years inside China. So everything we heard about the rare earths and the dominance of China, you could apply to the silicon metal market. So critical reliance on production. They're the supplier of last resort in the market. They can turn on coal-fired power to make silicon metal. We've got a diversification of end uses and potentially stronger growth than we were expecting in terms of the end uses and new high-volume applications for silicon. And also we have a problem with the carbon taxation, so it's very energy intensive, and actually a downside of the Chinese investments. They have some hydropower, but quite a few of them are still coal-powered. So it will be really interesting to think over the next period. So in the period to 2025, we believe you need 5 or 6 more silicon smelters than have been announced so far. And they can be turned on relatively quickly. But in terms of investment and where you're going to put it with access to your green power, so you're not imposed carbon taxation, it's a really, really big question for the market. And again, diversification away from the supply chain that's dominated silicon metal to photovoltaics to the final whole panels that they make, heavily dominated by China. So I would keep your eye on that market despite its sort of yellow-green rating at the moment. Rare earths, Paul covered it really well, so I'm not going to spend too long on this. The share of the rare earth market of these neodymium, iron, boron, and magnets is growing very, very strongly. It's growing because of the wind turbines, the internal combustion engines, electronics, and other markets. And it's changing the balance of the market between the different commodities in the rare earth basket. So one small upside is that the Chinese mines are no longer quite so well suited to the future mixes of rare earths that we need going forward. So they're not particularly heavy in the neodymium, praseodymium, or the dysprosium, terbium that you need within the basket for the magnet making. However, they are the dominant player, and you can see at the bottom left here the share of the market they've had up until 2017, and looking forward they still remain well over 50% of the supply chain. The policy changes in the US that incentivize the full development of the chain inside the US with no Chinese content will be a game changer in terms of the investment here. And it will be really interesting which mines may be supplied pools of facility and to be processed outside China, beyond the oxide to the magnets, to make sure that the world has the materials it needs. It will need high prices to get there. So the people who are consumers today will struggle with the prices in the meantime as that money needs to go into the market. We think there needs to be considerable investment and development of new rare earth mines in the period to 2028 when the real deficit starts to kick in. So we need people to be putting money into rare earths now in order for those mines to be operational when that supply crunch really happens in a couple of years' time. Copper. So renewable energy is very copper intensive, nothing new there. If you look at the far side, you can see the different types of renewable energy. You can see that offshore wind consumes 10 times as much copper to generate a gigawatt as natural gas or coal. Even onshore wind and solar are 2 or 3 times what you'd have needed for traditional energy sources. And if we look at what that means for conductors, on the left here, that includes aluminium conductors, that's total volume of conductor. You can see the rapid growth, the at least doubling of the market over the next 20 years in terms of just the cores of the wires for moving that power around. So what does that mean at the bottom for copper? It actually means that all the growth in the copper market that we will see in the next 30 years comes from the greening of the economy. The historic markets are almost completely flat. All the growth comes from these new end uses. And we can see that green energy goes up to about 22% of the copper market over that forecast period. So hugely important. So the timing of those investments will play really strongly into, exactly these shares and exactly how the copper price plays in this period. Copper mining projects. The top left is just a scatter chart of all the existing copper mines. You can see the concentration that sits in South America, no surprise. Lots of little mines in China, again, no surprise. But if you look at the left here, these are the projects that are coming in, committed and probable projects. You've got the Chilean-Peruvian axis, facing some issues with operating in Chile, which we mainly see around royalties, not around capability of mining. They are very pro-mining. Slight social impact maybe in Peru. You've got the Central African issues. We talked a little bit about child labour. Maybe they've overcome that, but there's still issues with dealing with the governments in Central Africa. And then you've got the Russians, and I just want to move into the story on the Russian assets, because as you can see at the bottom there, we need projects. The current assets are not going to produce the copper we need, even over the next 3 or 4 years, without these new projects coming in. It's just not sufficient, and you can see some of the existing assets dropping out later on as they deplete and their grades go down. So Russian projects. The blues are mines and the yellows are projects. So Russia's actually the 8th ranked copper producer in the world, and with sanctions coming on, it becomes quite difficult to access that material. So 3 major integrated producers, all associated with an oligarch whose name is in the press at the moment. The projects are really quite big. So Udokan, Baimskaya, and Akzug are very large-scale copper deposits, and they've been assessed and worked on by Western engineering firms, applying Western technology, and the export markets into mostly into China for smelting. But it does put at risk, even if the horrible war in Ukraine is resolved quickly, their ability to move these assets through and to actually finance them and develop them quickly enough for them to come to the market as planned. So an additional risk, obviously we don't do business with them at the moment, but even when they come back, it could be a period of time before those assets are producing. So just to conclude briefly, I think I'm just about on time, the heat chart, as I promised, 2026 over 2022, you can see the basket as a whole has gone quite cold. And that's because of the inflated prices we've seen this year, last year, in the market. I mean, no surprise to anyone. But if we look at who stays at the top in 5 years' time, we've got the people we've talked about and the commodities we've talked about today. Lithium stays right up there. Cobalt, silver's a byproduct, it's a bit flexible. Copper and the rare earths sitting right at the top. We also have a question maybe about the platinum group metals. We heard about that at the beginning. So platinum itself could be quite high ranked. Silicon, down at the bottom there, because we do believe capacity will come in, but I think there are material risks around the forecast for silicon in the market, given the need for those new assets coming in. So just to conclude, geopolitics really are changing investment patterns. We're seeing different assets being financed in new locations. There isn't any consensus on how we'll reach zero carbon, although all the noises and people's desires are right, but the path is still unclear. Energy generation is calling on new commodities, and we need to be careful when we move into new commodities. That's why the automotive guys are going right to the mine. They're markets they don't understand well at the moment. And energy transmission, you need to remember it might be copper, but we're going to need a lot of it, and we don't know where it's coming from at the moment. So resilience comes from being local. We need incentives, we need government policy to support these investments, and hopefully through that the industry can achieve resilience and get the money it needs to develop into the future. Thank you very much.